Hi guys, HigheverRains here. So in response to my lore video, Why Are Dwarves Afraid of the Sky? I had an interesting question and a Codex entry pointed out to me by Daydreaming of Dragons. Just so you know, I do like to keep up with reblogs and tags and replies, so while asks are the best way to reach me with clarifying questions, if I see something in the replies, then I'm definitely going to try and cover it for you. There's just no guarantee that I will see it. So basically the overall question, a little out of context for the moment, but I'll correct that in a second, was: could a fear of falling into the sky be ultimately based on ancient memory of people being snatched up by dragons from the sky? Another story twisted by the Shaper to keep curious dwarves running off to the surface? I can't answer this without spoilers for Dragon Age Inquisition, including Trespasser and Descent, Dragon Age 2, Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age Awakenings, and The Calling. So if you don't want spoilers for any of these things relating to dragons, then please by all means leave now. I will wait. Okay. So the codex in question here was actually from Paragon Fairel's tomb, namely a notebook by a researcher who's excavating the ruins, presumably a dwarf, since there are references to his father and their shop being under the arch where Paragon Fairel's statue stood. The researcher is in the Hissing Waste prior to and just after the arrival of the Venatori. Basically, you get to run around and pick up all the different scattered pages. It eventually becomes a big long-winded codex entry. Now, it's important that we recognise this journal is written in 941 Dragon, or thereabouts. It's assuming that the Venatori began excavations during 941 Dragon after Haven was destroyed. The codex portion provided is this. I was tracing heraldry etched on a wall when I noticed pictures of weapons with winged lizards worked into the decoration. I spent the rest of the day translating the inscriptions. This verse was apparently passed down through Fairel's house, though his father to his father's father, and so on for hundreds of generations. From the stone, have no fear of anything, but the stone the sky betrays with wings of flame. If the surface must be breached, if there is no other way, bring weapons against the Urtok, and heed their screams. Urtok means dragon. Why was it part of an ancient crest? Why were these dwarves so worried about a monster they'd never see that they worked it into their weapons? This place becomes more impossible each day. But another part of the journal, presumably earlier, actually has this to say right before that. The inscriptions on the runes are all in the old tongue. Thank you, grandmother, for teaching this ungrateful brat Old Dwarven. The writing talks about the sad parting from the stone. Hundreds of years ago, several houses left their tithes to settle here under one leader. They were running from a war, or running so there wouldn't be a war. I read and reread the pillars until the light faded, but I know I'm missing something. I'll go back tomorrow. I wish Felicity's sister hadn't talked her out of joining me. I could use an extra pair of eyes to keep watch at night. It's a Paragon. The man who led the people here, who built this city, was Master Smith Paragon Fairel. Legend said he died in the Deep Roads during a war between two Tigers who used his rune work to build fantastic weapons of destruction. If he escaped up here, that means the records are wrong, or someone 1,000 years ago tried to pretty up the truth about his leaving. The most talented shaper of runes in Dwarven history, escaping with an entire house to the surface. Now that will fluff some beards in the Shaperate. My father said our old family business used to be near an archway that was part of Fairel's Paragon statue. I wish I could have shown him this. He's the one who wanted to believe our ancestors in the stone were still guiding us. Be nice to think if it were true, old man. And then we reach the portion of the codex that actually references the dragons here. I was tracing heraldry etched on a wall when I noticed pictures of weapons with winged lizards worked into the decoration. I spent the rest of the day translating the inscriptions. This verse was apparently passed down through Fairel's house, through his father to his father's father, and so on for hundreds of generations. From a stone I have no fear of anything, but the stone the sky betrays with wings of flame. If the surface must be breached, if there is no other way, bring weapons against the Urtok and heed their screams. Urtok means dragon. Why was it part of an ancient crest? Why were these dwarves so worried about a monster they'd never see that they worked it into their weapons? This place becomes more impossible each day. So the basic story here is that Paragon Fairel led his house up to the surface to escape or possibly prevent some sort of conflict caused by his master rune-making skills being used to create weapons of war. To put this in a bit of perspective, the Dwarven kingdoms have been more or less united under the king in Orzammar since Endrin's Stonehammer and Orset Garal. In fact, with the onset of the First Blight, there are only 4 Dwarven kingdoms: Kalsharak, Orzammar, Gundar, and Hormak. We can only map 2 of these, though. Gundar may be located over near Denerim due to a plaque that we find beneath Crestwood, and some orienting on the map. If you're interested in that, you can check out my Deep Roads map post that I made a while back, and I'll link to it below. Basically, Orset Garal is the Paragon that is mentioned in the Descent DLC, and the one who wrote the book, and he was there the last time that the Titans were awake, so a little bit of perspective on that. In regards to the idea of this poem in the Codex being passed down father to father, that seems odd. I don't know if this is a writing inconsistency, but things are not normally passed down to fathers, but actually to sons. It being passed down to sons makes more sense contextually, also in terms of the story of Repartha, Fairel's surface tig. Fairel's whole story actually ends up being about his sons and the aftermath after his death. We'll discuss more about Fairel and his really crazy surface tig in a later video if people are interested. What is important is that these journal entries come from a man studying the ruins, and the inscriptions it discusses refer to Fairel's tombs, so they are very old, and they are definitely on the surface. Since dwarves get their house name and their family line from Paragon, who heads their house, for a story to be passed down through Fairel's house, it should have begun either with Fairel or later. And if it did not, then it was a warning taken closely to heart because Fairel brought them to the surface. So either way, we're looking at a surface problem for these particular dragons. And this actually holds up. What matters is that Paragon Fairel's story about the stoneless sky being dangerous for dragons actually references the hissing wastes where they're emerging. The hissing wastes actually are known as a hotbed for dragons. The codex for the hissing wastes actually reads as follows. Felicity, you're chasing nonsense. Even if there were an old city buried in the hissing wastes, what makes you think the university would send you there on the chances you'll dig up an interesting slab of rubble? I skirted the edge of it once. If the wildlife isn't venomous, it's filled with fangs. The days bake, the nights freeze, and only other souls you've met are even worse reasons for being there than you do. I haven't even mentioned that dragons like to nest in the rocks. Ask Alphonse how he got the scar on his arm, he'll tell you. Leave that desert to the treasure hunters, my dear. Our empire is full of ruins. Let us find one in more hospitable climate, such as Mont-Simar in the spring. Letter from third-year university student in Valroyu to her younger sister. We also get an additional reference to dragons in the quest journal for Stop Venatori Activity in the Wastes, which is a war table mission. The Hissing Waste is a stretch of sandy desert north of the western approach, a lonely place where the wildlife is hungry and hostile. Among the hungriest and most hostile are the dragons that make their nests here. A rare person wandering into the waste is either hunting prized beasts or hoping to uncover evidence of a long-vanished civilization in the dunes. Expert from the Quest Journal. So this is an area that's known for its dragons, in particular the Sandy Howler, which you can find sleeping within Paragon Fairel's tomb itself.
There's our dragon.
She's right between us and that building. Think she did that on purpose?
I bring this up because part of the codex that refers to the dragon inscriptions is actually discovered in this area right near this dragon. A tig with dwarves struggling to get to the surface in a dragon-infested land is absolutely going to be afraid of dragons, and they will pass that warning along. But the original premise of the question was, could the dwarven fear of the sky stem from dragons attacking dwarves, and possibly carrying them off? And that question hasn't really been answered yet. There is something odd about the dragons regarding the dwarves, which I'll go over in a moment, but I think it's fair to say that at least in regards to the Repartha inscriptions, these were warnings that were meant to be taken rather literally from the fact that Repartha is built in a location that's literally a hotbed of dragons. Now, that being said, let's look at this warning poem again. From the stone, have no fear of anything, but the stoneless sky betrays with wings of flame. If the surface must be breached, if there is no other way, bring weapons against the Urtok and heed their screams. Several things strike me as odd here, and that requires a bit of a further explanation. Firstly, the poem describes what should happen if the surface is breached, so it appears to have been formed prior to the arrival on the surface. Another odd thing about this poem is the concept that the dwarves have no need to fear anything from the stone. I bring this up because, in collaboration with earlier mentions about the fall of the dwarven kingdoms in the First Blight, it seems to suggest that Repartha does predate the Darkspawn, or at least the dwarven awareness of them. And we get further evidence of this in another piece of in-game lore, this time from the landmark notice obtained at the Four Pillars in the Hissing Wastes, which is one of Fairel's tombs. Estoris, not only did we find the dwarven tomb precisely where I said we would, the writing on the stone uses a transitive verb found only in scripts that predate 700 TE. It means, obviously, that these ruins were built before the First Blight, just as I predicted when we started this expedition. I believe you owe me some gold. Avanthem. Now, Tevinter dating doesn't match the Chantry dates, which is the standard version that we tend to use. The math, thanks to work done by Penbrid in Conversations, the link is below, puts 700 Tevinter era at minus 494 ancient. For simplicity's sake and rounding, we're just going to say minus 500 ancient is the approximate latest time frame for Repartha, due to its linguistic structure and other evidence. Around this time, we also have the construction of Amirius, later known as Kirkwall, the largest civil war in Tevinter history, marking the beginning of its decline, and the Tevinter reconquering of the Anderfels. 700 TE is 100 years prior to the Chantry stated date for the fall of the Golden City, and the official beginning date to the First Blight. So, Repartha does in fact date prior to the First Blight by a number of different sources. As the Codex says, Dwarven kingdoms started to fall as early as 815 TE. That doesn't mean that Repartha was built at this time, though. It can date earlier, and in all honesty, it appears that it does. This is a video about dragons and dwarves, so I'll keep this relatively short, but we can see the strange gold mosaic tiles, and Solus's elven artifacts, and multiple Veilfire puzzles throughout Repartha. There is more than enough evidence here to suggest a very significant historical record. Repartha is absolutely older than believed. And what's the point of this fact? Well, this is where the events of Trespasser and the Descent come in. We know from Descent that the dwarves were once tied to titans, and we know from Trespasser that it was the elven Evan Eurus that hunted the titans, what they refer to in their stories as the Pillars of the Earth. At some point, the dwarves experienced a split from the titans, and it was after this point that the dwarven tradition of paragons comes in. It is this concept that the greatest among them are living ancestors, literally the embodiment of what the dwarves once used to be. This culture glorifies the past. Paragon Fairel is considered a paragon among paragons, according to the journal, and the greatest runemaker the dwarves have ever seen. So Paragon Fairel's legacy is tied to the post-Evan Eurus Titan conflict. And if that story has been passed down since before Fairel, the one about dragons, then we get some very interesting connotations. In the Temple of Mythal, the penultimate dragon queen, we get Veilfire runes that relate to a number of different pieces and parts of all of these puzzles that can only be read or understood by an Inquisitor who drinks from Mythal's well of sorrows. One of them, the one that I care about for this, is the rune inscription from the Codex Ancient Elven Writing. This elven writing, found in the Arbor Wilds, is so old there seems to be no way to learn what it means. There are whispers from the Well of Sorrows. It's impossible to understand the entire text, but certain parts suddenly reveal a shadow of their original meaning. His crime is high treason. He took on a form reserved for the gods and their chosen, and dared to fly in the shape of the divine. The sinner belongs to Dirthamen. He claims he took wings at the urging of Gillenan, and begs protection from Mythal. She does not show him favour, and will let Elganon judge him. For one moment there's an image of a shifting, shadowy mass with blazing eyes, whose form may be one or many, and then it fades. There's been some argument about what this form reserved for the gods is, but considering if Morrigan drinks from the well she gains the ability to become a dragon, and since Corypheus has a red lyrium dragon he's made to mock the gods, and since Tevinter worshipped old god dragons, and since Flemeth or Mythal or whatever name you'd prefer turns into a dragon on multiple occasions right in front of us, let's just accept that this form of the gods is a dragon. We know that the dragons sleep. We see this in the comic The Silent Grove, where Flemeth's older daughter Yavanna, the Witch of the Wilds in Antiva that Zevran actually mentions in Dragon Age Origins to Morrigan, has been guarding the sleeping great dragons and waking up the high dragons once more. If we're honest, technically we know dragons sleep because the old gods are still trapped underground and woken by the Darkspawn. And if there are doubts that the old gods are sleeping, I posit that wardens engage with the old gods in much of the blight through dreams, horrible nightmares, and this is the way that the old god Ethemiel actually finds the warden when the ambush occurs in Dragon Age Origins. Alistair himself will admit it's like it Soros. So this form of the gods, specifically the Evan Eurus, according to the Codex we're given, is that of a dragon, and we know from Trespasser that the dwarves are familiar with this shape, with the very concept of Mythal, once again penultimate dragon lady, and that it was the Evan Eurus that hunted the Titans, and are somehow responsible for the split from the Titans originally. In fact, ancient elven rhyme mentions Mythal and the dwarves in the same song, seen here courtesy of the Trespasser Codex entry Torn Notebook in the Deep Roads, section 3. Many of these pages are filled with sketches of elven statues, matching the ones found in the area, along with notes and what look like attempts to practice Kunlat. Trying to remember that old bedtime song about Mythal. My mother sang it the night before the Darkspawn came for my clan. It's the last time I ever heard her voice. Esa telnal, mithala mathenaras, Esa na emma, him solus evenuris, da durganlin banal malas elgara belinaris. Written beside each elven line is a corresponding phrase, likely a translation. I am empty, filled with nothing. Mythal gives you dreams. It fills you, within you, making our leaders proud. My little stones, never yours the sun, forever, forever. Haran said that we lost some of the old words. What if they've changed? Dugen Lin from Dugen Len? Little dwarves, never yours the sun? What did Mythal do here? Something's wrong. The lights in the walls are fading. Going to find help, it's not safe. Without light, Itwa Ost, you all fall. Itwa Adam, they all fall. Itwa Sam, we all fall. A little on Elven for you. The poem above uses the word Durgen Lin instead of Durgen Len. Here we have something very interesting. We know Durgen means stone, and the word for dwarves in modern parlance is Durgen Len, child of stone, which is what Solus calls Varric all the time. But the old version uses Lin, which shares a root with Valazlin, blood writing, and Lethalin, kinsman, so Lin is actually a word meaning more or less blood. So the original word for these dwarves was not children of the stone, but blood of the stone, and that's an intriguing difference coming from a civilization that excelled at killing titans, the original children of the stone, according to Volta in the Descent. It also doesn't strike me as a coincidence that this codex ends with Kunari practice on how to say everyone falls, but that's neither here nor there. Dragons have a strange mythos about them to the dwarves. They're not uncommon. In fact, people run into dragons underground all the time. And I don't just mean archdemons. We have several in-lore examples of dragons nesting in caves, living underground, and getting into scraps with characters time and again in dwarven areas or mines. Just to name a few, the dragon in The Calling, which attacks them in the deep roads, and which Duncan kills with some rather impressive dagger work or some dragon surfing. The dragons in Dragon Age Origins, that the Reavers call Andraste, has made its nest inside of the mountain where all of its eggs are and all of its mates live. The dragon in Dragon Age Origins' Ageless Quest, which was captured by the dwarves in as late as 590 Exalted, remember Paragon Ebrian and his Nog poetry? And held until Dragon Age in their own throne room by the stone, apparently. Here's the codex for that. The inscription is worn and old, overlooked by most as a carving detail. The beast is foreign, but the need is familiar. Home and hearth suffer beneath strength and strangeness. These new kin of this Ferelden are better as friends than strangers, so we resist on their behalf, and work with their users to bind with the stone. They no longer fear their skies, and we further our trade above. Lured from above, cornered and corralled, 3 standing in position, a 4th signals the throne. Stasis for the beast, so long as a king holds the throne. So long as a king wills it held. Inscription circa 590 Exalted. We also see a dragon living inside old ruins like those at the Brazilian Forest or the Dragonbone Wastes in Dragon Age Awakenings, which is, for better or worse, seemingly an old dragon burial ground. And that's why Tevinter decided to build there, though whether those ruins actually are Tevinter is another question entirely, given all that we know now. Then, skipping ahead to DA2, we encounter dragons in the Bone Pit Mine, where miners say they broke through into a nest. And we also encounter another dragon in the Deep Roads during the expedition. Later in the game, there's another dragon hanging out around the Bone Pit again. This one's scarier and bigger, but the place seems to have a history since it's effectively a Drakestone mine, Drakestone being sulfur or brimstone in our own world. Dragon Age Inquisition gives us plenty of dragons outside, but the codex for dragons combined from all 3 games is as follows. Dragonlings, newly hatched dragons, are roughly the size of a deer and voraciously hungry. They live for a short time in their mother's lair before venturing out on their own. The slender, wingless creatures are born in vast numbers, as only a few ever make it to adulthood. This one's seen in Dragon Age Origins and DA2. Drakes from Dragon Age Origins. Male dragons never develop into the winged monsters of myth. At most their forelegs grow, the vestigial spurs where wing membranes might have been. Once they have fully matured, males immediately seek out the lairs of adult females, and when they find one they move into her lair and spend the rest of their lives there hunting for her and defending her young. They will aggressively defend her nest, and many would-be dragon hunters have lost to their fiery breath and crushing blows from their tails. Dragons from Dragon Age Origins. Female dragons take much longer to mature than their male counterparts. They too undergo a metamorphosis of sorts at adulthood, but while males lose the use of their forepaws, females actually grow a third set of limbs specifically to serve as wings. Young females travel great distances looking for a suitable nesting site. Because of their nomadic habits, these are the dragons most frequently encountered by man. And high dragons, from Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age Inquisition. A fully mature adult female dragon is the High Dragon, a great monster of legend, the rarest of all dragonkind. These dragons hollow out massive lairs for themselves, for they need the space to house their harem of drakes as well as their eggs and the dragonlings. High dragons are seldom seen. They spend most of their time sleeping and mating, living off the prey their drakes bring back. But once every 100 years or so, the High Dragon prepares for clutching by emerging from her lair and taking wing. She will fly far and wide, eating hundreds of animals, most often livestock, over the course of a few weeks, and leaving smouldering devastation in her wake. She then returns to her lair to lay her eggs, and will not appear in the skies again for another century. In fact, with all of the old gods, sleeping dragons, nesting dragons, and dragon references, it's kind of strange if the dwarves don't encounter any dragons, especially the Legion of the Dead, and they more or less live out in the deep roads where these dragons nest. There's also something to be said for the fact that the dragons have the ability to repel the blight. Marek's dragonbone sword actually repels the blight, as we see in the Calling. They turned down the side passage, the hunter leading them now. All their weapons were out, and so Marek decided to follow suit. He drew his longsword, its pale-blade dragonbone, and etched with runes that glowed a bright sapphire. It drew the immediate attention of the others, and they ground to a sudden halt, staring at him in surprise. Uther stepped forward, eyes wide, gesturing sharply. Julian frowned nearby. "She wants to know where you got that," he explained. "I found it here in the deep roads," he admitted, "in the hands of a long-dead dwarf. I offered to give it back to the dwarves, but King Endrin refused." Uther nodded and made another hand gesture that didn't need to be interpreted. She was impressed. The others nodding approvingly, and turned to keep moving. Duncan hesitated, however. "Does it always glow like that?" he asked. "No, it's reacting to the darkspawn, I think." He held it out towards the wall, something he'd done when he'd first found the blade, and watched the reaction of the Grey Wardens as the corruption covering the wall recoiled away from the blade like a living thing. The stone beneath was now bared, sapphire light shining over it. "That's the dwarven sword that he found originally in Ortan Tig, which finally fell during the Fourth Blight back in the Exalted Age." You can insert more Nug poetry here. But the sword isn't the only example. Dragons nesting in specific areas in the Calling keep the Darkspawn at bay, and the whole reason they run into the dragon is because they're fleeing the Darkspawn in the first place. This is from the Calling 171 to 172. "Do you hear that?" Duncan finally asked. Each of them cocked their head, listening. There were only silence and shadows. It had also grown warm, Marek found, and he had assumed that the warmth he felt was a result of all the running and the sweating. But now they were still, and he was calmer. He realized it was something else. Mixed with the sulphurous stench was a dry heat wafting in the air. "I don't hear anything," Genevieve growled. "Exactly. Where are the Darkspawn? I can barely sense them." The commander seemed stunned not to have realized it herself. They stood for a long minute, doing nothing, before she finally waved them to proceed. "We need to find a way through. Whatever reason the Darkspawn aren't following us, perhaps we can use it to our advantage." And then later. As they began to spread out, however, Kel suddenly hissed, "Stop!" Genevieve turned back, annoyance clear on her face, which instantly turned into alarm. The hunter stared upward, his eyes wide and stark with fear. She followed his gaze at the same time as Marek did, as they all did, and they saw what it was that had kept the Darkspawn from pursuing them. Something descended down upon them from above, something large, something with great leathery wings. "Dragon," Kel breathed. We find out in Inquisition, from the Learn More About Dragons War Table operation, from draconologist Frederick of Seralt, I don't even know how to say that dragons are resistant to and avoidant of the blight in all forms, including red lyrium. So here's what you get from all of the advisors for the full picture. If you go with Josephine, you get this expert from Frederick of Seralt's report. "You cannot imagine the wealth of knowledge in Navarra. I could spend years reading the physical descriptions of dragons alone. I shall have to spend more time here. For the moment, however, I've discovered that dragon slayers of the past believed dragons to be unusually resistant to the blight. In fact, some believe that dragon physiology was capable of stemming the spread of the infection, though this was a mere hypothesis and never fully explored. Did you know? I sat on a chair made entirely of bleached dragonbone. It was magnificent, if not very comfortable." If you go with Liliana, you get this excerpt. Within the carcass of the abyssal high dragon, we found cysts of hardened flesh. Sister Bridget, a scholar from Navarra, said she had seen once or twice similar nodules in other beasts. To protect itself, the body grew a barrier around a foreign object that could not be removed. Naturally, of course, we cut into the cyst. The flesh within was blighted. We immediately examined all the other cysts and found in the other dragon carcasses. Each time we found the blight. The only conclusion we can draw is that dragons can stem the spread of the blight with their own bodies. They cannot do this indefinitely, as the existence of Corypheus's dragon suggests, but they are more resistant than other creatures. And if you go with Cullen, you get this. We found a clutch of intact dragon eggs, which are currently incubating in Skyhold. For study purposes only, of course. How dangerous can baby dragons be? We found little else. From eyewitness reports, the adult dragons never venture close to where the red lyrium grows, even though they could easily have done so. I can only conclude that the creatures instinctively understand that red lyrium poses a threat. Red lyrium, as we learned during Varric's Inquisition quest, is blighted lyrium. We have one final reference to dragons in terms of the dwarves, and this is somewhere far beneath Iduk and Tig, and the source is from the information about Sandal and Bodan Fedek that we find in the World of Thedas books. Bodan finds Sandal down in the deep roads during a treasure hunting expedition. The passage is as follows. When they reached their destination, what Bodan saw nearly took his breath away. A glittering wall that depicted ancient tales of heroes and paragons. Elves, dwarves, dragons, and creatures Bodan could not name, brought to life in a mosaic of gold and jewels. It was vast beyond imagining, stretching upward far above the glow of the torch into the upper reaches of the chamber, and down, its lower segments buried beneath the rocks they stood upon. Bodan took a torch and walked the wall, trying to gain a better understanding of its scale. When an old cave-in halted his progress, he turned around, and that was when he saw the boy, a dwarven child about 5 years old. At that moment he first heard the Darkspawn coming. They had seen the party, or heard them, and they were coming for blood. Bodan grabbed the child and ran. His men collapsed the tunnel behind them, and Bodan caught a last glimpse of the jewelled wall as the deep roads came down around it. From World of Thedas 2, page 175. This jewelled wall is not something we ever get to see, but the fact it's so massive and that it descends below the cavern floor seems to be implying that it's been cut in half rather than just built down into the ground. We know from the descent that the Titans are the original shapers of the earth, and that they move tunnels about easily. One does so after you leave Valta. There's no way back into the wellspring afterward. In fact, the Titans are known for living underneath the Tigs very deep, and Iduk and Tig is below even Orzammar. And there's something else weird about this wall, and that's the description itself. The only massively tall, jeweled golden mosaics that we see in the game are not dwarven, they're elven. Old, ancient elven, and they depict the Evanyoris, or stories of the past. The content of golden dragons, elves, dwarves, and the creatures Bodan can't name. These might possibly be Kunari, who have shown up on these sorts of mosaics before, but maybe something else. Seem to suggest that this wall dates back to that time as well. In fact, we have examples of these weird golden mosaics and the sorts of things that they might represent, because you spend your time collecting a great deal of them in Inquisition, assuming of course that you like collecting things, that is, and many of them are actually found in dwarven ruins, like Crestwood and such. Officially, elves and dwarves first started communicating sometime around minus 7,600 ancient. We're so far back now that there's no way to corroborate that. Whatever the case, we're talking about a very long history of dwarves being incredibly wary of the power of dragons, first as the Evanyoris, and then because they live in the deep roads, and they might be old gods, and are powerful enough to repel the blight that destroyed the Dwarven Empire. If there's something to be said for dwarves being carried off by dragons, I don't think it's actually linked to this fear of the sky, unless the sky itself represents two ancient dwarves, the Evanyoris. There just aren't really the stories in place for a link to a fear of the sky and a fear of the dragons in the way that the other tales do, especially not in the memories. Whatever Fairel might have been, his legacy in Orzammar is that he disappeared and presumably died. Repartha is never discussed in the memories, and since so much has been written out of the memories over the years, I don't think it really becomes a situation where the possibility of being carried off by dragons makes dwarves fear the sky. Because in the dwarven experience, there are dragons under the ground too, and there actually is a sky beneath the earth within the Titans that predates all of that. So, that's it for me. I hope that helped to clarify some points for people and proved intriguing for everyone else. I've got a couple things lined up for future videos or posts, but if you would like to ask a lore question or get some things clarified, or just hear my opinion on things we maybe don't have much information for, do feel free to drop into the ask box. You actually don't need a Tumblr to submit a question, just head over to my blog homepage and ask away. I'll only be taking comments or questions over there. Once again, thanks for watching.